Welcome to Dark Domain, where reality fades and the nightmares begin. You've just stumbled into a collection of the creepiest, mind-bending stories guaranteed to keep you wide awake. This isn't your average horror binge. You've just unlocked over 2 hours of unsettling tales that'll have you questioning your sanity. So settle in, turn off the lights, if you're brave enough, and let the terror unfold. And while you're here, share with us in the comments. What's the one thing you've seen that still gives you chills? And of course, smash that like button because we both know you're not going to sleep tonight anyways. The Beast of Pine Valley. There are places you don't go after dark. Everyone in Lexington knows that Pine Valley is one of those places. It's not far from the city, but it feels like another world once you pass through the thick trees that line the valley. The locals have always had stories about it, about strange noises, shadowy figures, and something that roams the woods at night. Most people chalk it up to superstition, a way to keep kids from wandering too far into the woods. But the stories are real. I'm Caleb Hart, a wildlife officer with the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife. I've spent the last 10 years patrolling state parks, managing wildlife, and dealing with the occasional bear or mountain lion sighting. I thought I'd seen it all until last week. It started with a call about a hiker who had gone missing near Pine Valley. Not unusual for this time of year. People always underestimate how easy it is to get lost in the dense woods. But something about this case felt off. The hiker, Tommy Harris, had been an experienced outdoorsman. He knew these trails better than most. His wife had reported him missing after he failed to come home from his usual hike. The search teams had already gone out combing the area for hours, but they hadn't found anything. No sign of Tommy. No footprints, no gear, not even a scrap of clothing. It was like he had vanished. When I arrived at the trailhead, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. The air was cool, the kind of crisp chill that comes right before winter sets in. I met up with Sheriff Thomas, who had been coordinating the search. "No sign of him yet," the sheriff said, shaking his head. "But something about this doesn't sit right with me. He was too good to just get lost." I nodded. I'd seen enough cases like this to know when something wasn't adding up. "You find anything unusual?" I asked. The sheriff hesitated. "One thing. We found some tracks about a mile up the trail, but they weren't human. Could be a bear, but I don't know. They were too big." I frowned. Bears were rare in this part of Kentucky, but it wasn't impossible. Still, the way the sheriff looked at me, I could tell there was more he wasn't saying. I headed up the trail, following the path the search team had already cleared. It was quiet, unnervingly so. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the soft crunch of my boots on the dirt. After about half a mile, I found the tracks the sheriff had mentioned. They were deep, wide, and clawed, like something heavy had passed through here. But they didn't look like bear tracks. Not exactly. They were longer, the claws sharper, more defined. I knelt down, running my hand over one of the prints. Whatever made these was big, bigger than anything I'd ever seen in these woods. The sun had nearly set by the time I reached the top of the ridge overlooking Pine Valley. The trees stretched out in every direction, a sea of dark green against the fading light. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural growl echoing through the valley. I froze, my hand instinctively going to the radio strapped to my belt. I scanned the tree line, trying to pinpoint where the sound had come from, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then, in the distance, something moved. A shadow darted between the trees, too fast for me to get a good look. But it was big, easily taller than a man, its body hunched, moving on all fours. For a second, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but then I saw it again. The creature stopped just at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the fading light. It was watching me. I slowly backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. Whatever it wasn't afraid of me. And it wasn't a bear. The next morning, I returned to the valley with a full team. More officers, a few park rangers, and the sheriff. I told them what I had seen, but I could tell they didn't believe me. The tracks were still there, but the creature was gone. We spent the better part of the day searching the valley, but there was no sign of Tommy or the creature. By dusk, most of the team had given up, heading back to town with nothing to show for it. But I couldn't let it go. I stayed behind, determined to find something, anything, that would explain what was happening. As night fell, I returned to the ridge where I'd seen the creature. The air was thick with tension, the kind you feel when you know something's watching you. I didn't have to wait long. Just after midnight, I heard the growl again, low, rumbling, and much closer than before. I turned, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, and there it was. The creature stood at the edge of the trees, its hulking body silhouetted against the night. It was massive, at least 7 feet tall, with long, muscular limbs and thick, matted fur. Its eyes glowed faintly in the beam of my flashlight, reflecting a cold animal intelligence. But what struck me the most was its face. It wasn't entirely animal. There was something almost human in its features, something primal, ancient, and terrifying. I took a step back, my mind racing. I knew I had to run, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. The creature let out a snarl and started toward me, its movements fast and fluid, like it was gliding over the earth. My body finally kicked into gear. I turned and bolted down the trail, the sound of the creature crashing through the trees behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps, the cold air burning my lungs as I sprinted for the truck. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear it, closer now, gaining on me. I reached the truck and threw myself inside, slamming the door just as the creature barreled out of the woods. It stopped short, its massive body silhouetted against the headlights, its eyes locked on mine. For a moment, we stared at each other, neither of us moving. Then, without warning, the creature turned and disappeared back into the trees, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. I filed my report the next day, but no one believed me. The official story is that Tommy Harris got lost, wandered too far off the trail, and died of exposure. They never found his body, but that's the explanation they went with. It was easier than the truth. But I know what I saw. There's something in Pine Valley, something that's been living there for years, maybe longer. It's fast, it's powerful, and it's hunting. And it's still out there. The Black River. They call it the Black River, a stretch of water just outside Lafayette, Louisiana. On the map, it's nothing special, one of countless rivers winding through the dense swamps and bayous. But the locals know better. They tell stories about it, passed down through generations, stories about things that shouldn't exist. My name is Luke Carson, and until a few weeks ago, I didn't believe in any of that. I was a wildlife biologist, in town for a project studying migratory bird patterns in the bayou. My life was all about science, facts, and evidence. If you couldn't measure it or explain it, it didn't exist. But then I saw the river. It started when one of the locals, an older man named Earl, told me about the disappearances. He ran a small bait shop near the docks, the kind of place you stop at for a cold beer and some fishing supplies. I was in there picking up a few things when Earl leaned across the counter and asked me if I'd heard about the Black River curse. I laughed it off at first, but Earl was serious. People been going missing out there for as long as I can remember, he said, his voice low. First it was fishermen, then campers, kids. Some folks say it's the river itself. It don't like people poking around where they don't belong. I nodded, humoring him. What do they think it is? Gators? The water? Earl shook his head. Ain't no gator big enough to do what I've seen. The river. It's got something else. Something that don't belong to this world. I thanked him, bought my supplies, and left. I didn't think much of it until the next day, when I found out one of the other biologists on my team, a guy named Chris, had gone missing. He'd taken a canoe out on the river the previous afternoon to collect water samples and never came back. At first, we thought he might have gotten lost or had an accident, but when we found his canoe the next morning, something didn't add up. It was floating near the shore. There was no sign of Chris. The local authorities did a search, but after a few days they wrote it off as an accident. Maybe he'd fallen out, and the current took him. But I knew better. I'd been on that river. The current was slow, sluggish. Something had happened out there, something we couldn't explain. The more I thought about it, the more Earl's words came back to me. About the river, the disappearances. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening out there, it wasn't normal. So I decided to find out for myself. That evening, I borrowed a small motorboat from one of the locals and headed out on the Black River. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the water, but even in the daylight, the place felt wrong. The trees loomed overhead, their branches tangled like skeletal hands reaching for the sky. The water was dark, almost black and thick with algae and silt. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. The usual sounds of the swamp, birds, insects, the distant croak of frogs, faded until there was nothing but the gentle hum of the boat's engine. I stopped the boat near the spot where we'd found Chris's canoe. The air was thick, humid, and still. I cut the engine and let the boat drift, listening. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a ripple in the water, barely noticeable. But then something massive moved beneath the surface, dark and slow, like a shadow passing under the boat. I stood up, peering over the edge, but the water was too murky to see anything clearly. I told myself it was just a gator, maybe a big one, but deep down I knew that wasn't it. Suddenly the boat lurched, tipping violently to the side. I grabbed the edge, trying to steady myself, but something was pulling the boat down. I looked over the edge and saw something. Long, pale shapes coiling beneath the surface like the tentacles of an octopus, but too thin, too long. They wrapped around the boat, tightening, dragging it down. Panic set in. I scrambled for the engine, trying to restart it, but the boat was tipping too far. The water was rising around me, the blackness swallowing everything. Then I heard it, a sound I'll never forget. A low, guttural growl vibrating through the water, through the air, through me. It wasn't an animal, wasn't anything I'd ever heard before. It was ancient, angry, alive. The boat tipped completely and I was thrown into the water. The cold hit me like a shock, knocking the wind from my lungs. I flailed, trying to swim, but the water was thick, pulling me down. I could feel something moving beneath me, something massive, circling, waiting. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw them. Shapes, pale and distorted, moving through the water like ghosts. They weren't fish, weren't animals. They were people, or at least, they had been. Their eyes were hollow, their skin stretched and bloated, their mouths open in silent screams. They floated just beneath the surface, their hands reaching for me, pulling me down, down into the black. I fought, kicking and thrashing, but their grip was cold, unrelenting. My vision blurred as the world went dark, the water filling my lungs. And then, nothing. I woke up the next morning, lying on the riverbank, soaked to the bone. My boat was gone, the river calm and still, as if nothing had happened. I don't know how I survived. I don't know what pulled me out, or why. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back to that river. Chris was never found, and no one believed my story. They said it was the heat, the stress of the job getting to me. But I know what I saw. I know what's out there. The Black River isn't just water. It's alive, and it's hungry. The Mirror's Eye. I've never been one to believe in the supernatural. As a photographer, I've spent my life capturing the world as it is, through the lens of my camera. I trust what I can see, what I can control. But recently I've come to understand that not everything can be explained by light and shadows. Not everything is in focus, even when the lens says it is. My name is Adam Walker, and this is a story I never thought I'd tell. It started 2 months ago when I moved back to Providence. I had been away for years, chasing photography gigs across the country, but the city had a way of calling me back. The familiar brick buildings, the narrow streets, the old charm. It was all still here. I set up my studio in a small, quiet part of town, hoping to settle down and find work doing portraits, weddings, and maybe a few art pieces on the side. The studio was perfect. A large room with windows that let in the soft, golden light of the New England sun, and an old mirror that the previous tenant had left behind, leaning against the wall. The mirror was tall, framed in dark wood worn at the edges with a few cracks spiderwebbing across the glass. I thought it added character to the place. I didn't know then that the mirror had a history, or that it had its own way of seeing the world. My first few weeks in the studio were uneventful. I had a steady stream of clients, local families, couples, and even a few tourists passing through. I'd position them in front of the old mirror, using it as a prop to add depth to the portraits. The photos came out beautifully. The clients were happy. Life was good. But then the strange photos started appearing. I was reviewing a set of portraits late one night, flipping through the shots I had taken earlier that day. A family of 4, standing in front of the mirror, smiling at the camera. But in one of the shots, something was off. I zoomed in on the reflection in the mirror, and there, in the glass, was a figure. A woman standing just behind the family, her face blurred and distorted, as if she were in mid-scream. I stared at the screen, my heart racing. I hadn't seen anyone else in the studio that day. The door had been locked. There was no way someone could have been there without me noticing. I checked the other photos in the set. Nothing. Just that one frame, the woman's face twisted in silent terror, trapped in the mirror. I told myself it was a trick of the light, maybe a glitch in the camera. But the next day, it happened again. This time it was a portrait of a young couple. They were standing in front of the mirror, holding hands, smiling nervously as I snapped their photo. But when I reviewed the images, the reflection showed something else entirely. The couple's faces were contorted, eyes wide with fear, mouths open in a silent scream. The room behind them looked warped, as if the mirror had twisted reality into something darker, something grotesque. I didn't show them the photos. I couldn't. Over the next week, the strange reflections continued. Every time I took a portrait in front of the mirror, the photos would show people as they were. But their reflections were different. Distorted. Afraid. I stopped using the mirror after that, but it didn't stop the images. One evening I noticed something strange. It wasn't just the reflections that were off anymore. The photos themselves were changing. The people I had photographed, their faces would shift, their expressions would turn from happiness to fear, from calm to panic. And in the background, always lurking, was the woman. The same blurred, screaming figure I had seen in the mirror. It didn't make sense. There was no logical explanation for what was happening. I checked my camera, my equipment. Everything was fine. But the photos kept changing, growing more disturbing by the day. It was as if the mirror had somehow infected my work, warping the images into something I couldn't control. Then the nightmares started. Every night I dreamt of the woman. She was always standing in front of the mirror, her back to me, her long hair matted and tangled, her clothes drenched in shadows. In the dream, I would call out to her, ask her who she was, but she never turned around. She would just stand there staring into the mirror, her reflection twisted and broken. And every night I would wake up in a cold sweat, the same words echoing in my mind. She sees you. One night, after another sleepless stretch, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my camera, pointed it at the mirror, and snapped a photo. I don't know what I expected. Maybe some kind of proof that I wasn't losing my mind. I pulled the image up on my screen and stared at it, my hands shaking. There in the reflection was the woman. She was closer now, her face clear. Her eyes were hollow, her mouth frozen in a silent scream. But this time, something was different. She wasn't standing still. She was reaching out, her hand pressed against the glass as if she were trying to push through. And in the corner of the image, I saw something that made my blood run cold. My reflection, standing beside her, staring back at me. I tore the mirror off the wall that night, shattering it into pieces. I thought it would end the nightmare, that destroying the mirror would somehow free me from whatever curse it had brought into my life. But the next morning when I woke up, I found a photograph lying on the floor of my studio. A photograph I hadn't taken. It was of me, standing in front of the shattered mirror, my face contorted in fear. And in the broken shards of glass at my feet, I saw her, the woman, still watching. The perfect neighborhood. I've never been one to settle down. In fact, for most of my life, I've avoided it. But last year, when I was offered a job at a new law firm in Wilmington, North Carolina, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to finally buy a house and start fresh. The timing felt right, and for once, everything seemed to fall into place. The house I bought was in a gated community called Willowbrook Estates, a place that boasted pristine lawns, white picket fences, and friendly neighbors who waved at you from their front porches. It was everything you'd imagine when you think of the perfect American neighborhood. But there was something off about it. I just didn't realize it at first. My first few weeks in Willowbrook were uneventful. The neighbors were nice enough, polite, even if a little too friendly. There was Mrs. Caldwell, the elderly woman who lived across the street and baked pies for new residents, and the Millers, a young couple with 2 small kids who always seemed to be playing in their immaculate front yard. The Homeowners Association, HOA, was strict though. They had rules for everything: what color your house could be, how often you needed to mow your lawn, where you could park your car. It was a little over the top, but I figured it was just how these types of places worked. After all, I'd never lived in a community like this before. It wasn't until I met the head of the HOA, a man named Mr. Whitmore, that I started to realize just how unusual things were. Mr. Whitmore was in his late 40s, sharply dressed in a suit and tie, even in the blistering summer heat. He knocked on my door one Saturday morning, clipboard in hand, and flashed me a wide smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mr. Ryan Matthews, correct?" he asked, his tone overly cheerful. "I just wanted to welcome you officially to Willowbrook Estates." "Thanks," I said, a little thrown by his formal demeanor. "Everything's been great so far." "I'm sure it has," Whitmore replied, glancing down at his clipboard. "I just wanted to remind you of a few key guidelines. We're very particular about maintaining the community's standards." He went on to list a series of rules I already knew: keeping my lawn trimmed, making sure the garbage bins were out of sight, and even limiting the types of decorations I could put up. But it was the last thing he said that caught my attention. "And of course, we strongly discourage any behavior that might disrupt the harmony of the neighborhood," Whitmore said, his smile faltering for a brief moment. "We take the well-being of Willowbrook Estates very seriously." I nodded, not sure what he was getting at. "Sure, I'll keep everything in line." He left with another too wide smile, but the way he'd said it, harmony, stuck with me. It didn't sound like a suggestion. It sounded like a warning. A few days later, I saw something strange. It was late, around midnight, and I was coming back from a long day at the firm. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed something odd across the street. Mrs. Caldwell was out on her front lawn, dressed in a long white nightgown, staring blankly at her house. Her expression was vacant, almost like she was sleepwalking, but her eyes were open, wide open. I got out of the car and called her name, but she didn't respond. She just stood there, unmoving. The whole scene was eerie. There was no wind, no sound, just the faint glow of the streetlights casting long shadows across the road. Before I could approach her, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. Mr. Whitmore was walking down the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, heading straight for Mrs. Caldwell. He didn't seem surprised to see her out there. In fact, it was like he expected it. He gently took her by the arm and led her back inside her house without saying a word. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what I'd just witnessed. I wanted to go check on her, to make sure she was all right, but something held me back. Maybe it was the look on Whitmore's face. Calm, controlled, like everything was exactly as it should be. The next morning, I saw Mrs. Caldwell outside, watering her plants as if nothing had happened. She waved to me, cheerful as always, and I almost convinced myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. But that night it happened again. This time it was the Millers. I heard voices outside around 2 a.m., and when I looked out my window, I saw them standing in the middle of their yard, completely still. Both of them were just staring at their house. Their kids weren't with them. They didn't move, didn't speak. They were just there, like statues. And once again, Mr. Whitmore appeared, clipboard in hand, guiding them back inside without a word. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was seriously wrong in Willowbrook Estates. The next day, I decided to confront Whitmore. I knocked on his door, and when he answered, that same too-wide smile greeted me. "Mr. Matthews, what can I do for you?" he asked, his tone smooth as ever. "I've seen some things," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "People wandering around at night, like they're in a trance or something. What's going on here?" Whitmore's smile didn't falter, but his eyes darkened. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about." "Come on," I pressed. "Mrs. Caldwell, the Millers, they've been acting strange. Something's not right, and I want to know what it is." Whitmore sighed, lowering his clipboard. "We maintain a certain balance here in Willowbrook Estates, Mr. Matthews. A balance that ensures everyone's happiness, safety, and well-being. Sometimes that requires adjustments." "Adjustments?" I repeated, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. "What the hell does that mean?" He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It means that harmony is everything here. Disrupt the harmony, and the consequences can be unpleasant." I stared at him, trying to wrap my head around what he was saying. "Are you doing something to them? To the residents?" Whitmore's smile returned, cold and empty. "I do what needs to be done to keep Willowbrook perfect." That night I packed a bag. I didn't care how perfect the house was or how good the job paid. I wasn't staying another day in that place. I had seen enough. As I was about to leave, I heard footsteps outside my door. I froze, my hand on the doorknob, listening. The footsteps stopped, and a soft knock echoed through the house. I opened the door to find Mr. Whitmore standing on my porch, his smile gone. "Leaving so soon, Mr. Matthews?" he asked quietly. "I'm done," I said. "I'm not staying here." Whitmore's eyes narrowed, and for the first time I saw the cold calculation behind his calm demeanor. "You should reconsider." "I'm not going to be another one of your puppets," I snapped. "I don't know what you're doing to these people, but I won't be part of it." He sighed, looking almost disappointed. "That's unfortunate." Before I could react, Whitmore raised his hand, and everything went black. I woke up the next morning in my bed, my heart pounding. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare, but then I saw it, on my nightstand. A small white envelope with the HOA's logo stamped on the front. Inside was a single piece of paper. Written in neat, perfect handwriting were the words, "Harmony has been restored." I don't know how, but I could feel it. Something had changed. I wasn't the same, and I couldn't leave. The Hollow Ones. Most of the time, the job of a sheriff in Pine Ridge is pretty straightforward. Sure, we get the occasional fight at the bar, the odd runaway, but it's a small town. You handle the day-to-day and keep things quiet. I've been sheriff here for 8 years, and for the most part I've kept the peace. But a couple of weeks ago, things started happening that I can't explain. Things that don't fit in a report. My name is Sam Henry, and I'm still trying to make sense of what I saw. It began with a call from the outskirts of town. The Tate family, who owned a large stretch of land just outside the Pine Ridge Reservation, hadn't been heard from in days. The Tates weren't exactly social. Old ranching family, kept to themselves, didn't come into town much. But when their neighbors didn't see smoke coming from their chimney for a few days, they figured something was wrong. I headed out there with Deputy Rick Torres just to check things out. The drive took us over an hour, winding through fields of dry grass and dusty roads. The Tate Ranch sat in a small valley, the house itself looking like something from a bygone era. Weathered wood, shutters hanging off their hinges, the whole place giving off a feeling of abandonment. As we pulled up, the first thing I noticed was the silence. No animals, no wind, just stillness. We knocked on the door, but there was no answer. After a minute, Rick pushed it open, and the smell hit us. It was thick, cloying, the kind of smell that tells you something is very, very wrong. We stepped inside, guns drawn, and immediately knew that whatever had happened here, it wasn't good. The house was dark, the windows boarded up, and the furniture was old and rotting. The living room was covered in dust, but the weird part was the dining room table, set with plates, forks, knives, but the food on them was untouched, like someone had sat down to eat and then just left. Then we found the bodies. They were in the back bedroom, Earl Tate and his wife Marjorie, lying side by side on their bed. Both of them looked like they had been dead for days. Their skin was gray, mottled, and their eyes were sunken deep into their skulls. But the strangest part was their mouths. Their jaws were wide open, frozen in what looked like a silent scream. I've seen death before. Hell, I've seen bad death, car crashes, accidents, even a shooting. But this was different. This was unnatural. Rick and I called it in, and within an hour we had forensics on site. The medical examiner couldn't figure it out. No signs of struggle, no trauma, no obvious cause of death. But there was something else. Something under the skin. Their bodies felt hollow, almost like there was nothing left inside them. But the real trouble started when we found their son. Caleb Tate had always been a quiet kid, kept to himself, worked the ranch with his parents. No one in town really knew him that well, but he wasn't a troublemaker. Just odd. We found him in the barn, sitting in the dark, covered in dirt. He didn't speak when we entered, didn't even look up. He was just sitting there, staring at the ground, his face blank. Rick tried to talk to him, but he didn't respond. His clothes were filthy and his hands were covered in what looked like dried blood. I figured he was in shock, probably found his parents like that and hadn't moved since. But when we tried to bring him in, Caleb finally looked up. His eyes, they weren't right. They were too wide, too bright, like he hadn't slept in days. And there was something else in them, something I can only describe as emptiness. As we escorted him to the car, he started whispering, his voice low and raspy. "They're coming," he said. "They're in the ground. Hollow. Waiting." I didn't know what he was talking about, but the way he said it chilled me to the bone. We kept Caleb in the station overnight, hoping to get him to talk, but he never said another word. He just sat there, staring at the floor, unmoving. Later that night, I headed back to the Tate Ranch to look around some more, see if we missed anything. As I walked through the property, the silence that had unnerved me earlier returned, even heavier now. I wandered out toward the barn, the sky dark, no moon in sight. That's when I noticed something odd. The ground near the barn, it was uneven, like it had been dug up recently and filled back in. I crouched down and brushed the dirt aside, revealing what looked like a shallow grave. I started digging, using my hands to pull back the dirt, and after a few minutes I hit something solid, a wooden box. I pried it open, and inside was something I'll never forget. It wasn't human, at least not anymore. The thing inside was shriveled, pale, its limbs twisted unnaturally. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, and its mouth, just like the Tate's, was wide open in a silent scream. But its eyes were still there, sunken and glassy, staring up at me. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I knew this wasn't a normal grave. Whatever was buried here, it wasn't dead. I went back to the station to report what I'd found. But when I got there, Caleb was gone. The deputy on duty swore he hadn't seen anyone come or go, but Caleb had vanished from his cell without a trace. No broken locks, no signs of a struggle. He was just gone. The next morning, we found 2 more bodies, local farmers dead in their beds, with the same hollow look, the same wide-open mouths. And the rumors started spreading. People talked about the Wakan Tanka, spirits that lived in the earth, things that were neither alive nor dead, waiting to rise. Old stories, passed down for generations, of creatures that would crawl out of the ground and steal your soul while you slept. I don't know if I believe that, but I do know this. Something is happening in Pine Ridge. Something old. Something that's been here long before any of us. And it's not done yet. I keep hearing Caleb's voice in my head, those last words he spoke before he disappeared. They're in the ground, hollow, waiting. And now I wonder how many more of us will end up just like the Tates. The other side. I've always been a skeptic. Growing up in Charleston, I heard my share of ghost stories, legends of haunted plantations and spirits lingering in the thick southern air. But I never believed in any of it. Not until last month. My name is Ben Everett, and I'm a detective with the Charleston Police Department. I've spent the last 15 years solving crimes, real crimes with real culprits. But what happened to me in that hotel room? I still don't have a rational explanation. It all started with a murder investigation. Daniel Harper, a prominent real estate developer, was found dead in his downtown penthouse, strangled in his sleep. There were no signs of forced entry, no defensive wounds, nothing to suggest a struggle. The coroner said the cause of death was asphyxiation, but something about the scene felt wrong. Daniel's face, twisted in terror, his eyes wide open, looked like he had seen something he couldn't escape. His wife, Lauren, swore she'd been asleep beside him and didn't hear a thing. I could tell she was genuinely shaken, but I've been around long enough to know that shock doesn't equal innocence. We combed through the security footage from the building, interviewed everyone who had been in and out, but came up with nothing. It was like Daniel had been murdered by a ghost. A few days into the investigation, I found myself working late at the station, staring at the photos from the crime scene. There was something in Daniel's expression that I couldn't shake, a look of sheer panic like he'd been trapped. I tried to piece it together, but the harder I thought, the more frustrated I became. That's when I got the call. A local hotel, the Wentworth Mansion, reported a disturbance in one of the rooms. The desk clerk claimed that guests were hearing strange noises coming from the room next to theirs. Whispers, furniture moving, someone knocking on the walls. When security went to check, they found the room empty, but the temperature had dropped to near freezing, and a foul smell was filling the air. They'd heard the same thing the night before, and when they went in, they found the room in complete disarray. No one had checked into that room for weeks. I was too deep into the Harper case to care much about a ghost story, but something made me go down to the hotel. Maybe it was a gut feeling, or maybe I just needed a distraction from staring at the same unsolvable case for hours. The Wentworth Mansion is one of those old Charleston hotels, built at the turn of the century, full of history and charm, and apparently, ghosts. When I arrived, the manager greeted me nervously, his eyes darting around like he expected something to jump out at any moment. "It's room 314, he said. "We've had complaints from guests for the past 3 nights. No one's in there, but something is." He handed me the key and I made my way up the grand staircase, the polished wood creaking beneath my feet. Room 314 was at the end of the hallway, and as I approached I felt a chill in the air, an unnatural cold that seemed to seep through the walls. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was dark, the heavy curtains drawn. The smell hit me first, something rotten, like decaying meat. I flipped on the light, and that's when I saw the room. The furniture was overturned, the bed sheets ripped off, and the walls, they were scratched, deep grooves carved into the plaster as if someone had been trying to claw their way out. I stood there for a moment, my skin prickling with unease. It felt like I wasn't alone. And then I heard it, a whisper. At first it was faint, like a breath against the back of my neck, but it grew louder, more insistent. until it sounded like someone was right behind me, their voice rasping in my ear. "Help me." I spun around, my heart racing, but the room was empty. I don't scare easily. After years on the force, I've seen things that would make most people lose sleep for weeks. But this was different. The voice. It wasn't just in my head. It was real. I stepped back into the hallway trying to catch my breath. That's when I saw her. At the far end of the hall, just for a second, there was a woman. She was dressed in a long, dark gown, her hair hanging loose around her shoulders. But her face was pale, gaunt, her eyes sunken, like she hadn't slept in years. She stared at me for what felt like an eternity, and then she was gone, just like that. I stood frozen, my mind reeling. I didn't know what I'd just seen, but I knew I couldn't leave. I had to figure out what was happening in this hotel, and how it connected to Harper's murder. The next morning, I dove into the hotel's history. It didn't take long to find the story. Room 314 had been the scene of a tragic death over 80 years ago. A woman named Eleanor Whitfield had lived in the hotel during the 1920s. She was engaged to a wealthy businessman, but on the night of their wedding, she was found dead in her room, strangled. The official report said it was a suicide, but local rumors told a different story. They said her husband-to-be had a darker side, that he'd been abusive. Some said he'd killed her. Others claimed it was something else, something the old-timers refused to talk about. Eleanor was buried, but some claimed her spirit never left the hotel. That night, I returned to room 314. I didn't bring backup. This wasn't a case I could explain to the department, and I wasn't even sure what I was doing there myself, but I had to know. The room was as cold as before, the air thick with the same sense of dread. I sat on the edge of the bed, waiting, my hand resting on my service weapon, as if it could protect me from whatever was happening here. Hours passed and nothing. I started to think maybe I'd imagined it all, maybe stress from the Harper case had gotten to me. But then just as I was about to leave, the lights flickered, the temperature dropped, and the whisper returned. "Help me." The voice was louder this time, clearer, and then the door to the bathroom creaked open. I stood, heart pounding, and walked slowly toward the door. Inside, the bathroom mirror was fogged over, though the room wasn't warm enough for that. I wiped the glass with my hand, and written across the surface in long, jagged letters were two words: "It's him." I stumbled back, trying to make sense of it. The voice. Eleanor was trying to tell me something, and then it clicked. Harper's wife Lauren hadn't heard anything. She hadn't seen anything, but Harper had. He had been looking for a way out of something bigger than either of us understood. He'd found room 314, found Eleanor, and she had tried to warn him. But it was too late. Harper's death wasn't just a murder. It was a warning. There was someone still out there, still connected to the woman in room 314. Something that hadn't died, even after all these years. I don't know how to explain what happened next, but I left that hotel knowing one thing for sure. Charleston isn't just haunted by its past. There are things in this city that we were never meant to understand, and I'm not sure I want to. The Carnival secret. I never expected to end up in Santa Fe. Not that I had much choice. Life has a way of pushing you to places you never intended to go. For me, that place was a small, run-down carnival on the outskirts of town. A relic from another time. A place where the paint was peeling, the rides creaked, and the air smelled of stale popcorn. My name is Daniel Cruz, and I'm a reporter. At least I was. A few years ago, I had a good thing going back in Albuquerque, but that fell apart. Bad choices, bad luck. It's all the same in the end. So when I heard about strange things happening at Delgado's traveling carnival, I jumped at the chance to write again, even if it was just a piece for a local magazine. I didn't expect much, but I figured it'd be a good way to kill a few days. I didn't know I'd end up stumbling onto something that would haunt me forever. The carnival wasn't much to look at when I arrived. A handful of rusted rides, a few cheap games, and a small tent advertising the greatest sideshow on earth. It had seen better days, but there was a certain charm to it, a kind of melancholy nostalgia that drew in tourists passing through town. But that wasn't why I was there. I was there because for the last few months people had been disappearing. A teenager last month, a tourist the month before that, and now a local woman who had come to the carnival with her family. None of them had been found, and the only thing they had in common was that they had all visited Delgado's. I'd done my research before coming. The carnival's owner, Hector Delgado, had been running the show for nearly 40 years. He was a quiet man, kept to himself, and rarely spoke to anyone outside of his crew. But his carnival had a reputation, a dark one. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I knew there was something off about the place. The smiles on the workers' faces felt forced. The laughter from the crowd seemed hollow. And the sideshow tent. There was something about it that made my skin crawl. I decided to start there. The sideshow was a small tent tucked away in the far corner of the carnival, almost as if they didn't want it to be found. A hand-painted sign outside advertised the usual fare, freaks of nature, oddities, and wonders beyond belief. I'd seen plenty of sideshows in my time, and I figured this one would be no different. Cheap tricks, exaggerated deformities, that sort of thing. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and sweat. A small crowd had gathered around the stage where a man was performing. He was tall, thin, and covered in tattoos, his face expressionless as he balanced knives on the tip of his fingers. The crowd watched in silence, transfixed. But it wasn't the man who caught my attention. It was the woman standing off to the side, watching from the shadows. She was dressed in a long, tattered coat, her face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. There was something unsettling about her presence, something that made my instincts scream. I moved closer, trying to get a better look, but before I could reach her, the lights in the tent flickered and went out. The crowd gasped, and for a moment, everything was plunged into darkness. When the lights came back on, the woman was gone. That night, after the carnival had closed, I stayed behind. I told myself I was just there to get the story, to dig up whatever I could about the missing people. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. Something about this place was wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I made my way back to the sideshow tent, hoping to get a closer look at the stage, maybe find something the crowd had missed. But when I pushed open the flap, the tent was empty. No performers, no props, nothing. Just the faint sound of wind rustling through the canvas. As I turned to leave, I saw it, a trapdoor in the floor hidden beneath a thick layer of dust. It was small, barely noticeable, but there was no mistaking it. I knelt down, my hands shaking as I pried it open. Beneath the door was a narrow, winding staircase that led down into the darkness. I don't know why I went down there. Curiosity, maybe. Stupidity, more likely. But as I descended the stairs, the air grew colder, and the faint sound of something breathing echoed through the passage. The walls were damp, the stone slick beneath my fingers as I made my way deeper into the earth. At the bottom of the staircase, I found myself in a small, dimly lit room. It looked like some kind of underground chamber, the walls lined with old wooden crates and faded posters from carnivals long past. But what caught my attention was the metal cage in the center of the room. And inside the cage was something I still can't explain. It was human. At least it looked human. But its body was twisted, contorted in ways that didn't make sense. Its limbs were too long, its skin pale and stretched thin over its bones. Its eyes were wide, unblinking, and filled with a terror that made my blood run cold. I stepped closer, my heart racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The thing, whatever it was, looked up at me, its mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came out. Just a low, guttural moan, filled with pain and fear. Behind me, I heard the door creak open. I spun around, my flashlight catching the outline of a figure standing in the doorway. It was the woman from the sideshow, her wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow over her face. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice low and cold. What is that?" I stammered, my eyes darting back to the cage. She stepped into the room, her gaze never leaving mine. "That's not for you to know." I took a step back, my mind racing. This is what's been happening to the people who disappeared, isn't it? You're keeping them down here. You're turning them into that. She didn't respond. Instead, she reached into her coat and pulled out a small silver key. Without a word, she unlocked the cage and let the creature out. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as the thing crawled toward me, its eyes filled with desperation. I tried to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't listen. The woman stepped closer, her voice barely a whisper. We all belonged to the carnival in the end. I don't remember how I got out of there. The next thing I knew, I was stumbling through the empty carnival grounds, the distant sound of laughter echoing in my ears. The morning sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the rides, but the place felt abandoned. I never went back to the carnival. I never filed the story either. No one would have believed me, and even if they did, what could they have done? But I know what I saw. And I know that somewhere beneath the carnival, the cage is still there, waiting. The Night Caller. It started with the phone calls. I had just moved to Helena, Montana, trying to escape the noise of city life. This small, quiet town seemed like the perfect place for some peace and solitude. But the peace didn't last long. The first call came late on a Tuesday night around 2 a.m. I was half asleep when my phone rang. Without checking the caller ID, I answered. "Hello?" Nothing. Just static. I hung up, thinking it was a wrong number. But the next night it happened again. Same time, same static. I thought it was odd, but I brushed it off. Maybe someone had a crossed line, or maybe it was some prankster who'd found my number. Either way, I didn't give it too much thought. Then the dreams started. At first, they were just fragments, flashes of images I didn't recognize. Dark forests, deep waters, figures standing in the shadows. But one thing stood out, always at the edge of my vision. A shape, distorted and shifting like something trying to come into focus but never quite making it. Each time I woke up, sweating, heart racing, I had this overwhelming feeling of being watched. I dismissed it as stress. After all, I had been working a lot lately, trying to settle into my new place, and I'd been feeling a little isolated. But the dreams persisted, and so did the calls. By the end of the week, they were happening every night at exactly 2 a.m. I even tried unplugging the phone from the wall, but it still rang. Somehow, it rang. One night I stayed awake waiting for the call. When it came, I was ready. "Hello?" I said again. This time there was something different, a faint sound beyond the static, like someone trying to speak. A word, maybe? Or a name? I leaned in closer, straining to hear, and then it hit me. Someone was whispering my name. My pulse quickened and I hung up, shaking. I couldn't take it anymore. The next day I went to the local phone company to ask if they could trace the number. After an hour of looking through records, the technician gave me a confused look. "There's no record of any calls to your number at that time," he said. "It's like they never happened." I left the office feeling more unsettled than before. Something was happening to me, and I had no way to explain it. That night, the dreams escalated. I found myself standing in front of a massive stone monolith, ancient symbols etched into its surface. The wind howled around me, and I felt that familiar presence again, watching. I turned, and for the first time I saw it. Something tall, something inhuman, standing just beyond the reach of the light. Its eyes glowed, and its mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile. Then it stepped toward me, and I woke up gasping for air. I knew I needed help. I wasn't crazy, at least I didn't think I was. So I reached out to the only person in town who might be able to give me answers. An old local historian named Gerald. Gerald was known for his research into Helena's history, particularly its stranger parts. When I told him about the calls and the dreams, he didn't seem surprised. He invited me to his house the next day, saying there was something I needed to see. When I arrived, Gerald led me to his basement, which was filled with books and strange artifacts. He pulled out a map of the area and pointed to a location in the nearby mountains. Back in the 1800s, there was a mining operation here, he said. But the miners discovered something unnatural. They called it the Night Caller. They said it was an ancient spirit, something that lived beneath the ground and that it could communicate through dreams. The legend goes that if it chooses you, there's no escape. I stared at the map, feeling a chill run down my spine. Why would it choose me? Gerald looked at me, his face grim. Sometimes it picks people at random. Other times it's drawn to something in their past. I didn't want to believe it, but everything made too much sense. The calls, the dreams, the feeling of being watched. It was all connected. I asked him what I could do to stop it. There's a ritual, he said, a way to sever the connection. But it's dangerous, and if you fail, it could claim you for good. I didn't have a choice. That night, Gerald came to my house, bringing with him candles, symbols, and old texts. We prepared the ritual, and I followed his instructions to the letter. As I spoke the final words, the wind outside picked up, howling like a storm. The lights flickered, and the temperature in the room dropped sharply. Then the phone rang. 2 a.m., sharp. I hesitated, staring at the phone, my hand shaking as I reached for it. Gerald motioned for me to answer. I picked up, expecting the usual static, but instead, there was silence. Deep, unnerving silence. And then I heard it, the voice. Clear this time. And it wasn't just a whisper. It was calling my name, over and over again, louder and louder, until it filled my ears, filled my head, and all I could hear was my name being screamed by something that wasn't human. I dropped the phone, gasping for breath. The room spun and I collapsed to my knees. Then everything stopped. The wind, the noise, the voice, it was all gone. Gerald helped me up, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a strange calm wash over me. It's over, he said, though I could hear the doubt in his voice. But I knew better. The night caller wasn't gone, not entirely. And as I lie awake that night, staring at the phone in the dark, I couldn't shake the feeling that, sooner or later, it would call again. And this time I wouldn't be able to hang up. The Shadows of Selby. I've always prided myself on being a rational guy. I don't buy into superstition, urban legends, or any of that paranormal junk you hear about in small towns. But after what happened in Selby, South Dakota, I'm not so sure anymore. My name is Kyle Murray, and I've spent the last 10 years working as a high school teacher, guiding teenagers through the chaos of adolescence. But last fall, something happened that I can't explain, something that still haunts me every day. It was mid-October, a few weeks before Halloween, when the strange things started happening. The town of Selby is small, barely more than a few streets and a school. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone and nothing ever really changes. It's quiet, safe, until it wasn't. I first noticed it with my students. The kids in my history class, normally rowdy and loud, had started acting strange. Not all of them, just a few. Casey Bennett and her best friend Megan Cole, both seniors, had always been inseparable. Popular, confident, the kind of girls who ran the school. But lately, their friendship had taken on an unsettling edge. They were acting off. At first, it was subtle, whispered conversations in the back of the classroom, long, unblinking stares that made me uneasy. But then things escalated. I'd catch them glaring at other students, and not in the usual teenage mean girl way. No, this was different. They weren't just angry, they were filled with something darker, something I couldn't put my finger on. Then people started getting hurt. It began with small accidents, a broken arm during gym class, a cheerleader falling down the stairs. But as the days went on, The accidents became more severe. One of my students, Jake Saunders, was found unconscious behind the bleachers, his face bruised and bloodied as if he'd been in a fight. But no one had seen anything. Jake didn't remember who attacked him, just that he'd felt someone watching him before everything went dark. The town brushed it off as normal teenage trouble, maybe even bullying gone too far. But I knew something wasn't right. There was a pattern emerging, and it all pointed back to Casey and Megan. Wherever they went, chaos seemed to follow. One day after school, I caught Casey in the hallway alone for once. I asked her if she knew anything about the fights or the accidents. She just smiled at me, that unsettling smile I'd seen far too often lately. "Sometimes," she said, "people get what they deserve." Her words sent a chill down my spine. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the way Casey had looked at me, the darkness in her eyes. It wasn't just teenage angst, it was something else. I started digging around, trying to figure out what was going on. I even went to the town library, searching through old records and newspapers, hoping to find some clue. That's when I stumbled upon something strange. Selby had a history. Every 30 years, like clockwork, strange incidents were recorded. Fights, unexplained deaths, strange lights in the sky. There were stories dating back to the 1950s, all pointing to the same time of year, late October. And the most disturbing part? In every one of those cases, it involved a pair of teenage girls. I couldn't ignore the similarities. Whatever was happening now had happened before, and it always centered around two girls. The deeper I dug, the more certain I became that Casey and Megan were at the heart of it. The night everything came to a head, the sky was clouded over and the air was thick with the promise of rain. I was grading papers in my classroom after hours when I heard a noise. Footsteps, faint but steady, echoing down the hallway. I assumed it was one of the janitors, but when I stepped into the hall, it was empty. And then the lights flickered. I stood there for a moment listening. The air felt charged, like the electricity wasn't just in the wires, but in the walls, the floors, even in the air itself. That's when I heard it. Whispering, faint at first but growing louder, surrounding me from all sides. I turned the corner and froze. Casey and Megan stood in the middle of the gymnasium, facing each other, their hands raised toward the ceiling. The air around them seemed to shimmer, almost like heat waves, distorting the space around them. The whispers were coming from them, though their lips weren't moving. They were staring at each other with a look of intense focus, like they were channeling something. The moment they saw me, the temperature in the room plummeted. It felt like stepping into a freezer, the cold biting at my skin. I opened my mouth to speak, to demand answers, but the words died in my throat. Casey's eyes locked onto mine and she smiled, dark, twisted. Megan mirrored her expression. "You shouldn't have come here, Mr. Murray," Casey said softly, her voice layered with something that wasn't entirely her own. It was deeper, older. "You can't stop this." The lights above us flickered again, then shattered, plunging the gym into darkness. I felt a sudden pressure in my chest, like a heavy weight pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. It was as if the room itself was closing in on me, suffocating me. Then I saw them, shadows, dark shapes moving along the walls, circling us. They weren't human, but they moved with intent, with purpose. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, filling my head until I thought I'd go mad. I stumbled backward, trying to get away, but the shadows followed, closing in. Casey and Megan didn't move, they just stood there watching as if they were in control of the shadows, directing them toward me. I don't remember how I got out of that gym. The next thing I knew, I was outside, gasping for air, my heart racing as I leaned against my car. The school was dark, silent, as if nothing had happened. But I knew what I had seen. I knew what Casey and Megan were. Whatever they had tapped into, whatever power they had found, it wasn't natural. It was ancient, something that had been in Selby long before any of us. And now it was awake again. I left Selby the next day. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. I couldn't. There's no way to explain what I'd seen without sounding insane. I don't know what happened after I left, but I heard rumors. More accidents, more strange deaths. And through it all, Casey and Megan remained untouched, unbothered. Some things can't be explained. Some things shouldn't be disturbed. Whatever darkness lives in Selby, I pray it stays there. The pressure. I never thought a road trip could turn into a nightmare. Driving across the open plains of Texas, you expect flat horizons, empty highways, and the occasional stop for gas. What I didn't expect was to find myself running for my life, trying to escape something I couldn't even see, something that was inside me. My name is Derek Monroe, and I'm a long-haul trucker. I've been driving these routes for over 20 years, and I've seen my fair share of strange things on the road. Accidents, bizarre weather, even the occasional UFO nut parked on the side of the highway. But nothing like this. It all started a few weeks ago on a run from Amarillo to Lubbock. It was a quiet morning, the kind of day where the sky is an endless blue, and the road stretches out in front of you like a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the plains. I'd just finished refueling at a small gas station on the outskirts of Amarillo, and was getting ready to hit the road again when I saw him. The man came out of nowhere, stumbling across the parking lot toward my truck. He was holding his head in his hands, his face twisted in pain, like he was trying to keep his skull from splitting open. "Help me!" he gasped, collapsing against the side of my truck. I jumped out of the cab, rushing over to him. "Hey man, you okay? What's going on?" He looked up at me, his eyes wide with terror. "It's in my head. The pressure. It's too much. You gotta help me. I can't stop. I can't stop moving." Before I could ask him what he meant, he bolted, just took off running toward the highway. I called after him, but he didn't stop. He was running like his life depended on it, clutching his head, weaving between the cars on the road. I stood there stunned, watching as he sprinted across the highway. That's when I saw the truck. It came barreling down the road, and in one terrible instant, the man was gone, struck by the 18-wheeler. The impact sent him flying, his body crumpling onto the pavement. I ran over, but it was too late. He was gone. The cops showed up a little while later, and I told them everything I knew, which wasn't much. They took my statement, asked a few questions, but it was clear they didn't have any more answers than I did. Just another tragic accident, they said. But something about the whole thing didn't sit right with me. The way he'd been holding his head, the way he'd said he couldn't stop moving. There was something more going on. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important, something that made no sense. Then, a couple of days later, I started feeling it. It began as a dull pressure, like a headache that wouldn't go away. At first, I thought it was just stress from the road. Too many hours behind the wheel, too many sleepless nights in cheap motels. But the pressure kept building, a relentless pounding in my skull that got worse with every passing hour. By the time I was halfway through my next run, the pain was unbearable. It felt like my head was going to explode, like something was pressing in on me from the inside, crushing my brain. I couldn't think, couldn't focus. All I could do was drive. Then I heard the voice. At first, it was just a whisper buried beneath the hum of the engine, barely audible over the roar of the tires on the pavement. But as the pressure in my head grew, so did the voice. Louder, clearer, until it was all I could hear. "Keep moving," it repeated over and over again, drilling into my brain like a command I couldn't ignore. Keep moving. I tried to stop. I pulled over on the side of the road, hoping the pressure would ease if I just rested for a bit. But the moment the truck came to a stop, the pain spiked. It was like a knife twisting in my skull, forcing me back behind the wheel. I had to keep going. If I didn't, I knew my head would burst apart, just like that man back in Amarillo. I floored the gas, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. The pressure eased, but only slightly, like I was buying myself time. I drove for hours, through empty highways, past tiny towns, through the unrelenting flatness of Texas, my head pounding with every mile. But the voice never stopped. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to keep moving, had to outrun whatever was inside me. I turned off the main highway, taking back roads and side streets, trying to get as far away from everything as I could. But no matter how fast I drove, the pressure stayed with me. At some point, I found myself on a narrow 2-lane road, the kind that stretches on forever without a soul in sight. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the pavement, and the pressure in my head was growing worse. I could barely keep my eyes open, my vision blurring from the pain. That's when I saw the sign, 12 miles to Amarillo. I don't know why, but something about that felt wrong, like I'd been driving in circles, like I was being pulled back to the place where it had all started. The voice in my head grew louder, more insistent. Keep moving, don't stop. But I couldn't do it anymore. I had to stop. I had to figure out what was happening to me before it was too late. I pulled off onto a dirt road, the truck bouncing as it rolled to a stop in the middle of nowhere. The moment the wheels stopped turning, the pain slammed into me again, sharper, more intense than before. I screamed, clutching my head, the world spinning around me. And then I heard it, a high-pitched whine like feedback from a radio, coming from somewhere in the distance. I stumbled out of the truck, my knees buckling under the weight of the pain, and looked around. That's when I saw it. Off in the distance, standing alone in the middle of the plains, was a tall metal tower, a radio tower humming with power. I don't know how I knew, but something told me that tower was the source of everything. The pressure, the voice, the pain, it was all coming from there. I staggered toward the tower, every step sending fresh waves of agony through my skull. The closer I got, the louder the whining noise became until it was almost deafening, like my brain was being shredded from the inside. When I finally reached the base of the tower, I collapsed onto the ground, my hands shaking as I looked up at the metal structure. The voice in my head was screaming now, a constant barrage of words I couldn't understand. I didn't know what to do, I just knew I had to stop it. With the last bit of strength I had left, I grabbed a rock from the ground and hurled it at the control box at the base of the tower. The rock hit with a loud crack, and the sound of shattering glass filled the air. And just like that, the pressure stopped. I lay there for what felt like hours, gasping for breath, my head finally free of the crushing pain. The silence was overwhelming, almost suffocating, but it was a relief. The voice was gone. I don't know who built that tower or what it was for, but I know one thing. It wasn't just broadcasting radio waves. It was doing something else, something that got inside people's heads and twisted them, made them do things they couldn't control. I destroyed the control box, but I don't know if that's the end of it. There could be more towers out there, more people like me, trapped in their own bodies, forced to keep moving. I never went back to Amarillo, I couldn't. Too many unanswered questions, too many things I didn't want to think about. Now every time I'm on the road, I keep my eyes on the horizon, watching for anything out of place. Anything that might be pulling me back into the nightmare. And every time I hear the faint crackle of static on the radio, I turn it off. Just in case. The lights beneath. I've always considered myself a city guy. The forests, the wilderness, they never appealed to me. But I guess life has a funny way of putting you exactly where you don't want to be. My name is Daniel Scott, and I'm a detective with the Boulder Police Department. I've worked cases involving missing hikers before, people getting lost in the thick woods of the Rockies, some of them turning up days later, disoriented but alive. Others, not so lucky. But the case I took last month still keeps me up at night. It wasn't just about missing people. It was about something else. Something that shouldn't exist. It started with a call about a group of environmentalists who had gone missing deep in the Roosevelt National Forest, just outside Boulder. They'd been protesting a logging operation out there, camping in the woods to stop the logging company from moving forward. They had been there for a few weeks, making plenty of noise, but when the crew showed up to work that Monday, the protesters were gone. Their tents were still set up, their supplies untouched, but there wasn't a single person left at the camp. The whole group, 5 people, had vanished overnight. I was called in to investigate, and at first I figured it was just a case of some activists getting spooked and leaving in a hurry. Maybe they'd heard animals, or the weather had turned bad. But when I got out to the site, it was immediately clear that something much stranger had happened. The camp was located in a dense part of the forest, the kind of place where the trees block out most of the sunlight, leaving everything in a permanent state of twilight. When I arrived, the logging crew was standing around the perimeter, clearly uneasy. The air felt thick, heavier than it should have, and there was a sharp, almost metallic smell that I couldn't quite place. The tents were still standing, their flaps fluttering slightly in the breeze, but inside, everything was perfectly intact. Sleeping bags, clothes, food, all of it untouched. It was like the protesters had just stepped out for a moment and never came back. But what really caught my attention were the trees. Several of the trees surrounding the camp had strange markings on them, long, deep scratches that ran up the trunks, almost as if something had clawed at them. The marks were too high to be from any animal I'd ever heard of, and too precise to be caused by the wind or weather. What the hell happened here? I muttered to myself, running a hand over the rough bark of one of the trees. That's when I heard it. A low humming sound, barely audible, but definitely there. It seemed to be coming from beneath my feet, vibrating through the ground. I knelt down, pressing my hand to the dirt, and felt the faintest tremor, like something was moving deep underground. I wasn't alone. One of the protesters had a brother in town, Dylan Ramirez, and he insisted on coming out with me to search. He was convinced his sister, Isabella, wouldn't just disappear without a trace. We decided to stay overnight at the camp, hoping to pick up any sign of where the group had gone. As the sun set, the temperature dropped sharply, and the darkness around us seemed to thicken. The forest was unnervingly silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just the occasional rustle of the trees in the wind. Dylan sat by the fire, staring into the flames. "I don't get it," he said quietly. "They wouldn't have just left like this, not without calling." "I don't think they left," I replied, keeping my voice low. "Not by choice, anyway." He looked at me, his face pale in the firelight. "You think something happened to them?" "I don't know," I admitted, "but I've got a bad feeling about this place." Around midnight, the humming returned. It started faint like before, but this time it grew louder, pulsing through the ground in waves. Dylan stood up, looking around in confusion. "You hear that?" "Yeah," I said, my hand instinctively going to my flashlight. "Stay close." The fire flickered, and then, out of nowhere, the tree around us lit up with tiny green lights. At first I thought they were fireflies, but they were too bright, too steady. The lights glowed from within the trees, as if they were embedded in the wood itself. "What the hell?" Dylan whispered, his eyes wide. I took a step closer to one of the trees, shining my flashlight on the trunk. The lights were coming from inside the scratches, the same deep marks I'd noticed earlier. And as I watched, the lights began to pulse in time with the humming sound, growing brighter and more intense. Suddenly there was a loud crack, like wood splitting, and one of the trees behind us groaned and shook violently. I turned just in time to see the ground near the base of the tree begin to bulge upward, like something was pushing its way to the surface. "Get back!" I shouted, grabbing Dylan and pulling him away from the spot. The ground erupted, sending dirt and rocks flying into the air, and from the hole something crawled out. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before, some kind of insect, but massive. Its body was covered in a hard, translucent shell, and its eyes glowed with the same green light that was emanating from the trees. The creature's legs, long and spindly, clicked together as it pulled itself free from the earth, moving with an unnatural speed and grace. Dylan screamed, stumbling backward, and the creature's head snapped in his direction, its glowing eyes locking onto him. Without thinking, I grabbed a nearby branch and swung it at the thing, hitting it square in the side. The creature let out a high-pitched screech, recoiling from the impact, and darted back into the hole it had come from, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. We didn't wait around. Grabbing what little we had, Dylan and I ran, crashing through the underbrush, not stopping until we reached the logging crew's trucks parked at the edge of the forest. The next day, we returned with backup, armed officers and experts from the Forest Service. We scoured the area, but the hole where the creature had emerged was gone, filled in as if it had never been there. The lights in the trees had disappeared, and the strange humming sound had stopped. No one could explain the scratches on the trees or the pulsing lights we'd seen, and there was still no sign of the missing protesters. Officially, the case remains unsolved. The loggers were pulled from the area, the camp was abandoned, and the forest was left to its secrets. But I know what I saw. I know what's still out there, deep beneath the ground, waiting. Some things are better left buried. The hungry ones. It wasn't the type of place you'd expect to find anything worth worrying about. Just another diner off the highway, the kind that serves coffee that's too bitter and pie that tastes like it's been sitting out for days. The kind of place people stop at only because it's the last option for miles. That's why I didn't think much of it when I first heard about the disappearances. I'm Kevin Hayes, a deputy with the Flagstaff Police Department, and a couple of weeks ago, we started getting reports about people going missing along Highway 89. At first, it seemed like your typical runaway cases, drifters, out-of-towners passing through. But then locals started vanishing, and that's when things got weird. The missing people all had one thing in common. They were last seen at Grady's Diner, a hole in the wall just outside of town, surrounded by desert and nothing else. It was the kind of place you could easily forget existed. I decided to check it out. I figured it would be a routine visit, ask a few questions, and maybe get a lead on where these people went. But the moment I stepped through the door, something felt wrong. The diner was quiet. Too quiet. A couple of customers sat in booths, hunched over their plates, eating in silence. The waitress behind the counter gave me a tired smile, her eyes never quite meeting mine. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice flat. I shook my head and flashed my badge. "Deputy Hayes, I'm here to ask a few questions about the missing people." Her smile faltered and she glanced nervously at the kitchen door. "You'll want to talk to Grady. Is he here?" She hesitated, then nodded. "In the back." The kitchen door swung open and a large man in his 50s stepped out, wiping his hands on a greasy towel. He had the look of someone who'd spent his whole life working behind a grill, heavyset, with sweat stains on his shirt and a tired expression on his face. "I'm Grady," he said, his voice gruff. "What's this about?" "People have been disappearing," I said, keeping my tone calm. "They were last seen here. Do you know anything about that?" Grady's face hardened. "I don't know nothing about no disappearances. People come and go all the time. Ain't nothing strange about that." I studied him for a moment. He was lying. I dealt with enough people in my time to know when someone was hiding something, and Grady was hiding a lot. "I'm going to need to take a look around," I said. Grady's eyes narrowed. "Ain't nothing here but burgers and fries, officer." "Mind if I take a look in the kitchen then?" He tensed, and for a second I thought he might refuse. But then he stepped aside, waving me toward the door. "Go ahead. Ain't got nothing to hide." I pushed through the kitchen door and immediately regretted it. The smell hit me first, something rotten like spoiled meat left out in the sun. I looked around the cramped kitchen, taking in the greasy counters and the pile of dirty dishes in the sink. But what really caught my attention was the walk-in freezer in the corner. The door was slightly ajar, a faint whiff of decay wafting from inside. I glanced at Grady, who was watching me from the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I'm going to check the freezer," I said. He didn't respond. I pulled open the freezer door and the stench hit me full force. I gagged, stepping back as the cold air rushed out. But it wasn't the smell that made my blood run cold. It was what I saw inside. Hanging from the ceiling were slabs of meat. At first I thought they were just cuts of beef or pork, but as I stepped closer, I realized with horror that they weren't from any animal. They were human. Limbs, torsos, and heads, stripped of skin, blood drained, hanging like carcasses in a butcher shop. I stumbled back, my stomach lurching. I turned to Grady, who was now standing just inside the kitchen, his eyes dark, his expression calm. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking. Grady smiled. a slow, eerie smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "People gotta eat, deputy." I reached for my radio, but Grady was faster. He lunged at me, his meaty hands grabbing for my throat. I dodged to the side, knocking over a stack of dishes as I backed away. The other customers, no, not customers, the other things in the diner began to stir, their eyes shifting toward me, their faces twisted in unnatural hunger. I ran for the door, crashing through it and stumbling outside into the desert night. My heart raced as I fumbled with my car keys, desperate to get away. Behind me, I could hear the door of the diner creak open, followed by the slow, steady footsteps of something that wasn't quite human. I slammed the car door shut and floored the gas pedal, the tires kicking up dust as I sped down the highway, the diner disappearing into the darkness behind me. I reported what I'd found, of course, but when I brought the sheriff and a team back to the diner the next day, it was clean. The freezer was empty, the kitchen spotless, and Grady was nowhere to be found. No one believed me. They said I must have imagined it, that maybe I'd been out in the desert too long. But I know what I saw. I know what's out there. Something hungry. The Hollow Man. I moved to Duluth, Minnesota for the cold. People thought I was crazy, but I liked the way winter turned everything into a quiet, frozen world. After years of living in noisy cities, I needed the stillness. It gave me time to think, to heal. I didn't expect anything to disrupt my peace. Not here, in a small town where nothing ever seemed to happen. I was wrong. It started with a missing person, then another. By the time the third one disappeared, Duluth wasn't so quiet anymore. The news said they were unrelated cases, just bad luck, nothing more. But rumors spread quickly. Some people said it was a serial killer. Others said it was something worse, something not human. I didn't pay much attention. People loved to invent stories to make sense of the unknown. One evening, I was walking home from the hardware store when I saw him. He was standing across the street staring at me. At first glance, he looked like a normal guy, tall, lanky, dressed in a thick winter coat. But something was wrong. His face, though partially hidden in the shadow of his hood, seemed off. The angles were too sharp, the eyes too empty. I stopped, feeling an odd chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He didn't move, just stood there watching. I shook it off and kept walking, telling myself I was being paranoid. But the feeling didn't leave. It stuck with me all night, creeping into my dreams. The next morning, I found something strange. Outside my front door in the freshly fallen snow were footsteps. They led up to the door, then stopped. There were no prints leading away. I stared at them, my breath fogging the cold air. The tracks were deep, like someone had stood there for a while, watching, waiting. I glanced around the yard, but it was empty, quiet. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic on the main road. That night, I made sure all the doors were locked. I didn't see the man again, but I felt him, a presence, lurking just beyond the edges of my perception. I told myself it was nothing, just nerves, maybe lingering anxiety from my past life in Chicago. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The next day, I heard about another missing person. A woman, mid-30s, vanished from her home just a few blocks from mine. The police said there were no signs of forced entry, no clues, no leads. That evening, I saw him again. I was sitting in my living room, the TV on but muted. The snow had started falling heavier, blanketing the streets in white. As I glanced out the window, I saw movement near the edge of my yard. The man was back. Standing at the end of the driveway, his face still hidden, but I knew it was him. This time he didn't just watch. He started walking toward the house. I froze, staring at him through the glass, my heart pounding in my chest. He moved slowly, deliberately, like he knew I was watching but didn't care. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking, and dialed 911. "I need help," I said, my voice barely steady. "There's someone outside my house." The operator asked me to stay on the line, but I barely heard her. I was too focused on the man. He was closer now, his feet crunching in the snow. I could see his face more clearly this time, pale and expressionless, his eyes black and hollow. Then, he stopped. Right at the base of my front steps, his head tilted slightly, like he was listening to something only he could hear. My breath caught in my throat. For a moment, we just stood there, separated by a few feet of snow and glass. Then he turned, walking back down the driveway, disappearing into the night. When the police arrived, they found nothing. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but they gave me the same look people always give when they think you're losing it. "You've been under a lot of stress," one of the officers said. "Probably just your mind playing tricks." But I knew it wasn't a trick. It was real. The next day, I did some digging, asking around about the missing people. That's when I heard about the legend, the Hollow Man. Some old folktale, one I'd never heard before, but it was enough to make me feel sick. They said he was an empty thing, a shadow that took people, feeding on their fear, their despair. Some people believed he only showed up when something terrible was about to happen. I didn't want to believe it, but the stories matched what I'd seen. The pale face, the way he moved, the way he watched. It was him. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house made me jump. Every gust of wind outside sounded like footsteps. I tried to distract myself with TV, books, anything to keep my mind from wandering back to that pale face. Around 2 a.m., I heard the knock. It was soft at first, almost polite. 3 quick taps, then silence. My heart sank as I got up and moved toward the door. I didn't want to look, but I had to know. When I reached the front window and peeked out, there he was. Standing at the door, his hand raised as if he was about to knock again. I backed away, heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet wouldn't move. He knocked again, louder this time. I heard the creak of the front door opening, even though I knew I had locked it. Panic surged through me. I grabbed a kitchen knife, holding it in front of me as I moved slowly toward the entryway. But when I reached the door, no one was there. The house was empty. Still. Except for the sound of footsteps coming from the basement. I should have left then, but something compelled me forward. I followed the sound, my body moving against my will. I reached the basement door and opened it, the stairs creaking as I descended. At the bottom in the darkness stood the Hollow Man. His eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time, I saw his mouth move. He whispered something I couldn't understand, but it chilled me to the bone. Then the lights went out. I don't remember much after that. Just darkness, the sound of my own breathing, and the cold, empty eyes of the Hollow Man. I woke up the next morning in my bed, the house eerily quiet. I don't know how I got there, but I do know one thing. I'm not alone. He's still here somewhere waiting, and one day he'll come for me again. The Haunting of Shepherd's Ridge. My name is Mark Quinn, and I grew up in the suburbs of Kansas City, Missouri. I never expected to come back, not after everything that had happened. But sometimes the past calls you home, even when you don't want to answer. Shepherd's Ridge was an old housing development project my father had invested in back in the 90s. It was meant to be a sprawling suburban utopia, nestled in the woods just outside the city. State-of-the-art houses, luxury amenities, the whole 9 yards. But something went wrong. Midway through construction, the project was abandoned. Financial issues, they said. But there were rumors too. Stories of workers disappearing, strange accidents on site, equipment malfunctioning in ways no one could explain. The place had been sitting empty for almost 20 years by the time I got the call. My father had passed away a few months earlier, and his lawyer informed me that the rights to the development had fallen to me. I wasn't interested, but there were some legal loose ends to tie up, so I decided to check it out for myself. I arrived late in the afternoon. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the crumbling roads and overgrown yards. The houses were in various states of decay, some half-built, others nearly finished but long since reclaimed by the elements. It was a ghost town, frozen in time, and just standing there made my skin crawl. I parked my truck near what used to be the community center, a hulking concrete building that had never been completed, and grabbed the key from my glove compartment. According to the lawyer, there was still power in some parts of the complex, something I found hard to believe. The door to the center creaked open and the smell of mildew and rot hit me like a wave. Inside, the air was thick and damp, the walls streaked with water stains. I flipped a switch near the entrance and, to my surprise, the overhead lights flickered to life, buzzing faintly in the silence. I wandered through the building, my footsteps echoing off the empty walls. There were blueprints spread out on tables, old plans for what Shepherd's Ridge was supposed to be. The more I looked, the more I wondered why the project had really been abandoned. My father had always been vague about it, brushing off my questions when I was a kid. I made my way to the basement. That's where the main power grid was, and I wanted to see how much of it was still functional. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended into the darkness, the light from my flashlight bouncing off the concrete walls. The basement was larger than I expected, a maze of hallways and storage rooms, most of them filled with old construction equipment and forgotten supplies. I found the power grid in a back room, a massive, ancient-looking panel of switches and dials. But there was something else down there, too. A reinforced steel door stood at the far end of the room. It didn't look like it belonged there, not in the basement of an unfinished housing development. The edges of the door were scratched, like someone had tried to pry it open. There was no lock, just a small keypad next to it, the kind used for security codes. I stared at it for a long moment. I shouldn't have been curious. I should have just turned around, walked out, and left this place behind. But something pulled me toward it. Some part of me needed to know what was behind that door. I punched in a random sequence of numbers, not expecting anything to happen. But to my surprise, the keypad beeped, and the door unlocked with a soft hiss. Slowly, I pulled it open. Inside was a small, dimly lit room. In the center, surrounded by cables and monitors, was an old computer, the kind you'd see in a 1980s government facility. Its screen flickered to life as I stepped inside, the faint glow casting an eerie light over the room. The screen flashed, lines of code scrolling by before settling on a single message. "Hello, Mark." I froze. How the hell did it know my name? My hands were shaking as I moved closer to the screen. The cursor blinked, waiting. Then, the message changed. "You shouldn't be here." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. Was this some kind of sick joke? A leftover from the construction crew? But that didn't make sense. No one had been here in years. No one knew I was coming. And yet, this thing, whatever it was, knew me. I reached out, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, but before I could type anything, the lights in the room flickered and dimmed. The air grew colder, and the hum of the machinery became louder, almost angry. Then the door slammed shut. I ran to it, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The keypad outside had gone dead, leaving me trapped in the room with the computer. The screen flickered again, the words changing. "It won't let you leave." My heart pounded in my chest. "What won't let me leave?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The machine paused, the cursor blinking again before the next words appeared. "The others." Suddenly, the monitors in the room came to life, showing grainy, black and white footage from old security cameras around the complex. At first, the screens were empty, just the vacant streets and abandoned houses. But then I saw them, figures, moving in the shadows. Dozens of them shuffling between the buildings, their movements jerky and unnatural. They were everywhere, and they were coming toward the community center. I backed away from the screen, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal, no way to call for help. I was alone. The lights flickered again and the door creaked open. Slowly, in the dim light, I could see the hallway beyond, stretching into darkness. The monitors showed the figures getting closer, closing in on the building. I had no choice. I ran. I bolted out of the room, down the hall, up the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. I could feel something behind me, following, closing in. I burst out of the building into the cold night air and sprinted to my truck. The figures were there, lurking just at the edges of the street, watching. I slammed the door shut, turned the key in the ignition, and floored it, speeding out of Shepherd's Ridge as fast as I could. I didn't stop driving until I was back in the city, the lights of Kansas City shining in the distance. My hands were still shaking when I pulled into my driveway. I never went back to Shepherd's Ridge. I don't know what happened there, what my father had gotten involved in. But I've seen the figures since. In the shadows, in the corners of my vision. They're still watching, and they're waiting for me to come back. The echoes of Mercy House. There's something about old places. The history seeps into the walls, into the very air, until it becomes part of the place itself. You walk in, and it's like the past is still lingering, waiting to be acknowledged. Some people can ignore it. I've never been one of those people. My name's Dean Jacobs, and I've been a private investigator in Mobile for the better part of 12 years. Most of my cases are straightforward: cheating spouses, insurance fraud, missing persons. I've seen enough to know that the world is full of dark corners people don't want to talk about, but nothing prepared me for what I found at Mercy House. Mercy House was an old nursing home, tucked away in a quiet part of town, surrounded by a cluster of oak trees that made it feel like a place forgotten by time. I'd driven past it a dozen times without giving it a second thought. That changed when I got a call from David Shepard, the administrator of the facility. He sounded rattled. Something strange was happening at Mercy House, something that had the staff on edge. Residents were claiming to see things, people who weren't there. Lights flickering on and off, strange noises in the night, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. It was scaring the elderly patients, and some of the staff were starting to quit. "I don't know if it's just their mind slipping," David had said over the phone, his voice tight with worry. "But one of our residents, Mrs. Palmer, she's adamant. Says someone is visiting her every night. But the thing is, no one comes in or out." I wasn't one to buy into ghost stories, but there was something in his voice that made me take the case. When I arrived at Mercy House, the place was eerily quiet. The main building was an old brick structure, with ivy creeping up the sides, its windows darkened by thick curtains. Inside, the smell of antiseptic and old wood mixed with something else, something musty, like forgotten memories. David was waiting for me at the front desk. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe mid-30s, with tired eyes that suggested he hadn't slept in days. "I appreciate you coming," he said, leading me down the hallway. "We've had complaints before, but nothing like this." He led me to the second floor, where most of the long-term residents stayed. The hallway was lined with old photos of Mobile, black and white shots of the port, the old ironworks, and the downtown skyline. Everything felt too still, like the building was holding its breath. David stopped outside one of the rooms and knocked gently before pushing the door open. Inside was Agnes Palmer, an elderly woman in her late 80s sitting in a wheelchair by the window. Her white hair was pulled into a neat bun, and her eyes, though clouded with age, were sharp as they turned toward me. "Mrs. Palmer," David said softly. "This is Mr. Jacobs. He's here to help." Agnes studied me for a long moment before speaking, her voice thin but steady. "You won't believe me," she said, her eyes narrowing. "No one ever does." I knelt down beside her, lowering my voice. "Try me." She looked out the window, her hands resting in her lap. "It started about a month ago," she whispered. "At night I hear them. Footsteps in the hall. I thought it was one of the nurses, but when I opened my eyes, I saw him." "Saw who?" I asked. "A man," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Dressed in white. He stands at the foot of my bed, staring at me. He doesn't speak, just watches." I frowned. "Have you seen him more than once?" "Every night," she said, gripping the armrests of her wheelchair. And I'm not the only one. I spent the rest of the day interviewing other residents, and to my surprise, many of them had similar stories. They spoke of seeing figures in the hallways at night. Shadowy shapes, indistinct, but undeniably human. Some claimed they heard whispers, voices calling their names. Others spoke of cold drafts that would sweep through their rooms even though the windows were closed tight. One of the nurses, Jenny, pulled me aside after my interviews. She looked pale, her hands trembling as she handed me a set of keys. "You're not going to believe this," she said, "but I've been hearing things too. Voices. And last week, one of the residents, Mr. Calhoun, said he saw a woman in his room, sitting at the foot of his bed." I raised an eyebrow. And he died the next morning, she whispered. "Heart attack, they said." That got my attention. That night, I decided to stay at Mercy House to see for myself. I had a room on the second floor, just down the hall from where Mrs. Palmer slept. The air was thick with silence, the kind that makes you question whether you're truly alone. Around midnight, the temperature dropped sharply. The air turned cold, biting, like a winter wind had suddenly swept through the building. I checked the windows, locked. The thermostat, normal. But the cold persisted. That's when I heard the footsteps. At first, they were faint, like someone walking softly down the hall. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the room, the beam cutting through the darkness. The hallway was empty, but the sound of footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, echoing off the walls. I followed the sound, my pulse quickening as I reached the end of the hallway. There, in front of Mrs. Palmer's room, I saw it. A figure, a man dressed in white, his back to me. He was standing in front of her door, perfectly still. "Hey!" I called out, my voice loud in the quiet. The figure didn't move. I took a step forward, and as I did, the figure slowly turned to face me. There was nothing there. No face, no eyes, just emptiness. And then, in an instant, the figure was gone, dissolving into the air like smoke. I spent the next few hours trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I wasn't the kind of guy to believe in ghosts, but this was something else, something I couldn't explain. The next morning, I went through the records at Mercy House, digging into its past. That's when I found it. Back in the 1950s, the building hadn't been a nursing home. It had been a hospital, a state-run facility for the mentally ill. And the man Mrs. Palmer had described? He matched the description of Dr. William Granger, a doctor who had worked at the facility during that time. According to the records, Granger had been responsible for conducting experimental treatments on patients, electroshock therapy, lobotomies, things that were considered cutting edge at the time. But his methods were brutal, and several patients had died under his care. There were rumors that Granger had been obsessed with his work, to the point of madness. He believed that by pushing the human brain to its limits, he could unlock something deeper, something no one else had dared to explore. Granger died in the hospital in 1960, but it seemed like part of him had never left. I brought my findings to David, and together we made the decision to shut down that wing of the building. The staff moved the residents to other rooms, and for a while things seemed to quiet down. But every now and then I still get a call from Mercy House. They say that late at night, when the wind is just right, you can still hear the footsteps in the hallways, still feel the cold draft. And sometimes, just sometimes, the residents wake up with the distinct feeling that someone's watching them. I don't know what I saw that night, but I know this: Mercy House holds more than memories. It holds the echoes of the past, and some echoes never fade. And that wraps up tonight's unsettling journey. If you enjoyed these terrifying tales, or if they kept you awake, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more spine-chilling stories. Let me know in the comments which one left you the most rattled. And remember, the darkness is always closer than you think. Until next time, stay safe, stay scared, and whatever you do, don't look behind you.